Welcome to Navigating the Customer Experience. Want to improve your organization's customer service? Looking for insider tips to knock your customer socks off? Then you're in the right place. Here's your host, Yannick Grant.
Welcome to Navigating the Customer Experience. On today's episode, our guest is Adam Bryant. Adam is a senior managing director and partner at the ExCo Group, where he works with hundreds of senior leaders and high potential executives. As the creator and former author of the iconic Corner Office column in the New York Times, Bryant has mastered the art of distilling real-world lessons from his hundreds of interviews and turning them into practical tools, presentations, and exercises to help companies deepen their leadership benches and strengthen their teams. He also works with executive leadership teams to help drive their transformation strategies based on a best practices framework he developed for his widely praised book, The CEO Test: Master the Challenges That Make or Break All Leaders. So without further delay, sit back, plug your earphones in, and let's jump right into this conversation with Adam. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Unique. I really appreciate the invitation.
All right, Adam, we always like to ask our guests in their own words. Could you share a little bit about your journey, how it is that you got to where you are today?
Sure. So I was a journalist for 30 years, 18 years at the New York Times, spent a lot of years as a business reporter and interviewed a lot of CEOs. And I just found over time, the more I spent with CEOs, the more I wanted to set aside the usual questions people ask of CEOs about their company's strategy and their products and services and things like that, and just ask them kind of, how do you do what you do and how did you learn to do what you do? So I rolled that impulse up into this very simple what if in 2009. And it was, what if I sat down with CEOs and never asked them a single question about their companies, and instead just asked them about personal leadership lessons they've learned over the course of their lives and how they think about all the universal challenges of leadership, like hiring and building teams and culture and all those things. So that was kind of the initial idea, and sort of brought me very much into the leadership space. So I did that for a decade, interviewed more than 525 CEOs, started writing books and teaching leadership, and all that was a side project in addition to my day job managing teams of reporters at the Times. And then I left the Times 6 years ago to join my current firm, the ExCo Group. And as you said, our core business is kind of one-on-one mentoring and leadership development. And I've got 4 interview series on LinkedIn, and continue writing books and interviewing leaders about leadership, not about company strategies. So that's kind of the thumbnail.
Perfect. All right. So leadership is your thing, Adam. And I heard that you interviewed 500 and odd people. That's a lot of people to be talking about. And I can imagine that what would you say the ratio was in terms of gender, and even generation in terms of the number of CEOs that you interviewed? Would you say you got a wide cross section of different generations, and would you say it's more of a male to female higher ratio or vice versa, or do you think it was balanced? And did you find any differences based on those considerations that I just mentioned?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, and it was the 500 plus for the New York Times, and with all the interviews that I've been doing on LinkedIn since, I've now passed the 1,000 interview milestone. But to your question, so I told the story of how I created the Corner Office column based on that simple what if, and the other sort of guiding principle I set for myself from the very start was that I was going to embrace diversity in every sense of the word. Race, gender, nationality, for-profit, not-for-profit, size of company, really wanted to get as much of a cross-section as I could. Interviewed a couple of leaders from Jamaica as well, a guy named Lloyd Carney who ran Brocade Communications. And so my goal was very much to not just go down the sort of Fortune 500 list of CEOs, because then it's going to be, overwhelmingly white males, of course. And I really wanted to get a sort of complete view of leadership. And to your question about patterns that I was looking for, I mean, I think there are pretty clear patterns, like talking to young CEOs who run tech companies in Silicon Valley is is a slightly different conversation than somebody who's running a Fortune 20 company, for example. But on the specific question of gender, I mean, in first couple of hundred interviews I did, I'm always sort of looking for patterns. And sometimes when I would give talks, people would say, "Have you noticed any difference between men and women leadership styles?" And I have to say, where I come down is that I don't. There's just too many exceptions to the generalizations and stereotypes that people have about men and female leadership styles. So to the point is like, there's just so many exceptions that for me, the generalizations and stereotypes do break down at the sort of CEO level. People have written a lot about and they talk a lot about how one of the difference between men and women when they're coming up in their career is that women will sometimes feel like they need to be 100% qualified for a job before they go for it, whereas men are much more willing to raise their hand even if they're not ready. And that may be true, and there's a lot of research around that. But for people in the CEO role and their leadership style, I really didn't see any difference. To be clear, not in terms of whether they were the same. They had different leadership styles, but just around EQ or IQ or extrovert or introvert or different styles, it didn't break down along gender lines for me.
All right. Now, you said you way surpassed the 1,000 mark as it relates to CEO interviews, especially with your LinkedIn profile of interviews added to that. Across the many different interviews you've done, I imagine for CEOs across many different industries, what would you say are, let's say, 3 overarching themes that you found that is critical for a leader to be successful, especially if the leader is trying to ensure that customer experience is one of the KPIs that they believe in? It's not just about the operational of the business or making the profits, but having a culture where people value the internal customer experience. And of course, there's some, I would say, measurement or some assessment that's being done to ensure that it's being transcended to the external customer as well. What would you say are 3 overarching themes that you'd have picked up from, or trends that you picked up from those interviews?
Yeah, and it's a great question about what are sort of the common themes, the through lines from all the interviews. And I'll start with the idea of simplifying complexity, which I think is an art form. It's a skill. And I don't think you can be a CEO or an effective leader if you're not good at simplifying complexity. I mean, there's a lot going on in the world, in different industries, inside your company. And I really feel like it is a leader's job to be able to stand in front of their entire team at an all hands meeting or on a Zoom call and just answer those really simple questions that, frankly, little kids ask in the backseat of the car, right? Like, where are we going? How are we going to get there? When are we going to get there? And if not everybody does that, right? I mean, we've all encountered people who actually seem to add more complexity to things, but you've got to be able to simplify complexity and boil it down to the 3 or 4 things that are really going to matter at your company. And I just think that's a really critical skill. And depending on the nature of your business, but if you are in a customer service business and that's crucial to your success, then you've got to be really clear about how that is going to drive your success. And you can't be the leader who says we have 20 priorities and customer service is one of them. If it really is critical to driving your success, it has to be one of a handful of key priorities. And there's got to be a way to measure it. You have to talk about it all the time. You have to role model it and just keep shining that bright spotlight on why it's important. So I think that's one. In terms of a couple of other things, because people often wonder, like, how do I, if I want to be a CEO, like, how do I get to the corner office? And I find people are often trying to think of like, well, what's the right path? And they wonder, am I on the right path if I want to get that job? And based on all the interviews I've done, I've come down on the idea that there really is no right path per se. I mean, directionally, there's obvious things if you want to get to a certain place, you have to be moving broadly in the direction toward that. But in terms of the specific path, it's not, to me, it's not about sort of checking boxes and, getting certain titles. The thing that has really struck me about all the leaders that I've interviewed is that they make the most of the path that they are on. So it's not like they're wondering, am I on the right path? It's whatever they are doing. They've realized that there are life lessons and leadership lessons everywhere, and you can always be learning. And to me, that's one of the skills that really sets people apart, that whatever experience they're having, and the metaphor I like to use is that your experience is like this sort of wet towel, right? Like it absorbs all this experience, but then what do you do with that? And I think the best leaders take that towel and they sort of twist it and wring it and just get every last drop of insight and lesson around it, from it. Because again, there are lessons everywhere. You can learn from a bad boss, you can learn from a good boss, you can learn from watching teams, and so there's the really high performers to me is they're always making time to process and reflect and say, okay, what did I experience? What did I see? What are the patterns? What are the lessons that I can learn from that? And the final point I'll make in terms of how you succeed, I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but just one of them that I think really sets people apart is the simple idea of being a good listener. Because I feel like it's one of those things that it's not taught in business schools. I don't know of any business school that teaches a course on listening, but I feel like it's really an underappreciated superpower of good leaders. Because whenever you start thinking like I've got all the answers, like that's when you're dead in the water, right? And so you have to just have really great skills as listener to get everybody's best thinking out on the table, and so that you really know what's going on in your organization. Because I mean, history is filled with stories of big companies that got into trouble because nobody wanted to tell the boss the bad news. So you've got to not only be a good listener one-on-one and in team settings, but you've almost got to build an infrastructure at your companies so that you know what's really happening, and so that there's not some like bad news on the front lines or trouble spots that you're not hearing about. To me, those are the three things that jump to mind when you ask that question.
All right. So leadership is very important as it relates to delivering a strong customer experience. And I always tell my clients that, mud flows from the top of the stream. So meaning, if the leadership is poor and customer service or customer experience is not important to them, it really flows all the way down to the end user, which is the customer, whether it's a digital experience or face-to-face. In your experience, especially with so much technology, happening out there nowadays, we have Chat GPT, there's, a lot of artificial intelligence coming on board. And I mean, up to last night, I was watching the local news and they had a question poll that they were posing to Jamaicans stating, do they feel that their jobs are in jeopardy as it relates to, AI being so, evolving and coming about. And so I wanted your views on, as it relates to leadership, what are some ways do you believe? I don't think that people's jobs are going to become absolute. I believe that human interaction is something that we will always need regardless of the industry that you are in. And I believe the technology is there to definitely enhance the experience, not to replace it. But based on your research, across the different industries, what are some ways that you believe the leaders can help to reinforce, at least to strengthen any doubts that employees may have, to ensure that they recognize that the technology, the artificial intelligence is not there to get rid of them, but rather to make their jobs easier?
Yeah, and to me, what you just said is the answer, right? I mean, the point of AI and technology is to take care of much more of the routine things so that that we as human beings can add more value and let the machines take care of stuff. So ideally, it will take care of just those rote aspects of our job so that we can figure out better ways to add value, because that's ultimately what's about, right? Like how are we individually and as teams creating value for the company? And in terms of, leadership's role in all this, I often come back to the power of stories, and which is a big part of communication, because I think there are some leaders who are good at saying the right words and phrases, and it's easy to stand on a stage and say customer service is really important. But I think telling and sharing stories is how you make that real. And whether that stories about how you as a leader, customer service is really important to you, and your experience in your life and the success of the company, and then to sort of tell stories to highlight people on the team who've really gone above and beyond and make them the heroes. Because I think company culture, everybody talks about values, and a lot of culture is determined by who gets fired and who gets promoted, and compensation structures. But I often think about culture is determined in large part by the hero narratives that companies tell. Because if you think of companies like tribes, right, and they are tribes in a sense, that it's really like, who does the tribe hold up as a hero, and what did they do? And if customer service is really key to your success, then how do you as a leader tell the hero narratives, tell the stories, highlight the people who went above and beyond? To me, that's one of the ways, from a leadership point of view, you make people feel like, wow, this really is important. And it's not just the heroes within the company, but also telling the stories about your customers and how you are helping them, and having an impact on their businesses and their lives. So I often come back to this idea that leaders in many ways are like the storytellers in chief, and so they've got to tell those stories and share those narratives.
All right. Thank you for sharing, Adam. Now, Adam, could you also share with our audience, what's the one online resource, tool, website, or app that you absolutely can't live without in your business?
In my business?
Yes, in your business.
I'll say, I probably do spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, and I'm sorry if that sounds like a really obvious answer, but just in the work that I do, and I've got 4 interview series, and I really believe that LinkedIn has emerged as kind of the Facebook for business, and everybody's on it. And people have written about this before, but I also think it's just an important reminder that there's a lot of toxic stuff on different social media sites. And I know I just stated the blindingly obvious, Unique, but I do find LinkedIn is a pretty positive place, right? Like, people are generally pretty supportive of each other, and they kind of put their best selves there. So that's where I spend a lot of time.
Okay, perfect. Could you also share with us maybe 1 or 2 books that you have read that have had a great impact on you? It could be a book that you read a very long time ago, or even one that you read recently.
Yeah, just in terms of fiction, I recently finished a book called Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. I think it won the Pulitzer Prize. And I have, it's been a long time since I've read a work of fiction that had as much insight about human nature in it. There's just packed with wisdom. So I do recommend that. Nonfiction, I really like adventure books, I have to say. So, stories about whaling adventures in the old days, and how people survived. I really am drawn to stories about resilience and what people do when they're facing a really tough task. So I'm often drawn to that.
All right, perfect. Now, we have a lot of listeners who are business owners and managers who feel sometimes that their products and services, of course, are the best, right? But sometimes they lack the constantly motivated human capital. And so if you were sitting across the table from that person, what's the one piece of advice that you would give them to have a successful business?
In terms of how to motivate their team?
Yep.
Yeah, to me, it's about constantly going back to the why. And people talk a lot about mission and purpose. And I'll be honest with you, I find that conversation, especially happened in the last few years, right? just companies have been talking a lot about their purpose and mission statements, and some of them I will confess do make me a little skeptical because they are often very broad and general, and at such a high altitude they feel kind of disconnected from the business. Very often they're just some version of make the world a better place, right? But I think there is an art form to doing that right, which is to constantly be communicating people and reminding people about the impact that you're having as a business. Because my prediction, Unique, and like I'm not asking you to bet $20 on my prediction, but I feel like this moment we're in, where purpose discussions are so front and center, I think those are going to be shifting more towards impact over time. And to me, the difference is that when you talk about purpose, that's really about your intent, and that's very internal. You're basically saying, when I get up in the morning, this is my purpose. Nobody can question that, right? Because you say, this is in my heart. I think one of the things that's special and unique about business is that it's more about impact, which is how do you show that purpose in action, right? So to me, that's much more about like almost proof. Like we said, this is our purpose, but this is what we're doing. We want to show you. We want to be able to document and show you the impact that we're having. And I think as a leader, we can all get kind of pulled down to just the day-to-day of the business, but you often have to sort of pick your head up and remind people and just sort of take stock and say, look at the difference we're making in people's lives. And when you say those things, they should be tied directly to the business. It shouldn't feel disconnected. And you don't have to worry about being so lofty and everybody's making the world a better place. You can be very much like, look at the difference we're making for our customers and what we're doing, because that helps bring out people's like passion and pride. And then you're going to get that extra effort from them.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing. Now, could you also share with us, Adam, what's going on in your life right now that you're really excited about? Either something you're working on to develop yourself or your people.
Well, at a personal level, I'll be very mundane at the risk of oversharing too, Unique, but I'm really focused on ping pong these days.
Really? Are you trying to master it?
I hardly master it, but I'm so living in New Orleans now, and we moved here a few years ago. Our two daughters moved here, and so we joined them. As I recently passed a birthday with the number 6 in front of it, I sort of decided I want to get back in touch with my inner teenager and start taking up some sports and things. So I actually have a ping pong coach. I know that sounds pretty unusual, but
that's brilliant. That is brilliant.
I train with him a couple of days a week, and my metric and scoreboard of whether I'm getting better or not is I play my son-in-law once a week for a couple of hours. And what's cool, when you're 61 and you say, I want to get better at that, and you actually get better at it. That's pretty cool. So that's my very personal thing I'm focused on right now. But much more broadly, I mean, I have been in the leadership field, and I'm pretty passionate about it for a couple of reasons. I mean, I would say, like, if you give me a really big magic wand with 3 things to do it, I would get rid of racism, inequality, and bad bosses. Because I think there are still too many bad bosses in the world, and I think sometimes we underappreciate what a toxic effect they have on individuals and by extension their families. And that's not just to be negative about that. What also gets me out of bed is just trying to help people be better leaders, for those who do want to be better managers and leaders. And I think there's a huge responsibility and privilege that comes with that. My approach to leadership, I don't wake up in the middle of the night, pretending I've come up with some new theory. I take more of a journalistic approach to understanding leadership and interviewing people who are leading and have been leading for a long time. And then what I try and do is sort of share the insights and the stories and the frameworks and really open up that conversation so that people can say, wow, that's a great tip. I can take that and use it with my own team. So if at the end of the day I can make a small contribution and help people become better managers and leaders, that's pretty motivating.
Amazing. All right. Thank you for sharing, Adam. Now, our listeners would have tapped into this episode and they're quite intrigued by you and what you're doing. And, they'd like to follow you and get to know you, maybe even connect with you online. Where can they find you online?
Sure. So LinkedIn, easy to find me there. My personal website is adambryantbooks.com. And my firm is the ExCo Group. Our website is excoleadership.com. So it's excoleadership.com.
All right. Now, before we wrap our episodes up, we always like to ask our guests, do you have a quote or a saying that during times of adversity or challenge, you'll tend to revert to this quote? If for any reason you got derailed or, you got off track, the quote kind of helps to get you back on track.
Sure. There's probably a couple that I always fall back on, and I've heard this from CEOs I've interviewed, but one of them is that 95% of the worst things that happen to you in your life very often turn out to be the best things that happen to you in your life. And, that's not to say all of them, right? And some things that happen to you are there's nothing good about them. But when you think back on your life and sort of those moments of adversity that you faced, very often they did turn out to be like really important pivot points that helped you grow and build character. And there was a lot of lessons and insights there. So even though, when you're in the middle of something, it feels pretty dark, sort of know that over time, you're going to learn a lot from that. There's a couple of other shorthands. There's that expression, you're either winning or learning. It's not about winning or losing, but it's about winning or learning. So there's always lessons that you can and should be taking from whatever adversity you're going through. If you feel like you've failed or disappointed yourself, it's like, that happens to everybody, right? But the question is, what do you do with it? What is that wet towel of experience that you can then take and wring and say, okay, what are the insights here, and keep squeezing it for that.
Mm-hmm. All right, perfect. Thank you so much for sharing. We'll definitely have those two in the show notes of this episode. Well, Adam, we are at the end of our interview. I can't believe it feels like we just started talking, but thank you so much for jumping on this podcast today and sharing all of these great insights and nuggets as it relates to leadership, all of the great information and experiences that you've garnered over the years talking to CEOs, as you had mentioned, from so many different industries, from all different walks of life across the world. I am sure that anyone who listens to this episode will pick up at least one thing that they can run with to help them sharpen their leadership skills. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Unique. I really enjoyed it.
Just want to remind our listeners that you can follow us on Twitter at NavigatingCX, and feel free to join our private Facebook group, Navigating the Customer Experience Community. Until next time, I'm your host, Yannick Grant.
Thanks for listening. For more awesome resources to take your customer service game to another level, head over to navigatingthecustomerexperience.com. See you next time.